The classroom buzzed with excitement as students eagerly awaited the return of their graded test papers. Desks were cluttered with notebooks and pens, some students whispering predictions about their scores, others leaning forward in anticipation. In the middle of the room sat Maya, her hands gripping the edge of her desk as she took a deep breath. She had studied harder than ever for this test. She knew she had done well, she just needed the grade to prove it. Mrs. Peterson, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and an ever-present smirk, strode through the rows, casually placing graded papers in front of each student. Some students sighed in relief, others groaned, but it wasn't until she stopped at Maya's desk that the energy in the room shifted. Maya looked up, hopeful, only for her breath to catch in her throat. A bold red F was scrawled across the top of her paper. Her stomach dropped. "No. This can't be right," Maya murmured under her breath, her fingers tightening around the paper. She had answered every question, double-checked her work. There had to be a mistake. Mrs. Peterson leaned down slightly, her smirk deepening as she tapped the paper. "I expected better, Maya," she said, pausing for effect. "Oh wait, maybe I didn't." A few students chuckled, some shifting uncomfortably, while others exchanged amused glances. Maya swallowed the lump in her throat, her vision blurring as she struggled to hold back tears. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in around her. This wasn't just about a test. It was about something deeper, something Maya had felt all year but never had the proof to fight against. Until now. Maya sat frozen, staring at the glaring red F at the top of her paper. Her heart pounded, not with embarrassment, but with frustration and disbelief. She had spent nights studying, carefully reviewing every detail. She knew the material. She knew she had done well. But now, staring at the grade, she felt like the world had just shifted beneath her feet. Taking a deep breath, she slowly raised her hand. The classroom, still buzzing from the other students discussing their grades, quieted slightly as Mrs. Peterson turned to her with an amused look. "Yes, Maya?" the teacher asked, her voice dripping with condescension. Maya hesitated for only a second before speaking, her voice steady but soft. "Mrs. Peterson, I studied really hard for this. Can you tell me what I got wrong?" Mrs. Peterson tilted her head, feigning sympathy before shrugging lightly. "Maybe you just aren't cut out for this subject, Maya. Some students, well, let's just say, they have limits." The words hit like a slap. The air in the room grew heavy. A few students exchanged glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Others just stared down at their own papers, unsure of what to say. The comment wasn't subtle. It was deliberate. And Maya felt the weight of it. Lena, her best friend, sitting beside her, leaned in slightly, whispering, "This isn't fair. You worked so hard for this." Maya swallowed, her hands trembling as she turned the pages of her test. She scanned each question, reading through her answers carefully. Then, her breath hitched. Nearly all of her answers were correct, yet they had been marked wrong. Her stomach twisted as realization sank in. "This is wrong," she whispered under her breath, flipping through more pages. The pattern was clear. It wasn't a mistake. Mrs. Peterson hadn't graded her fairly. She had deliberately failed her. Maya took another deep breath, forcing herself to stay composed. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't let Mrs. Peterson see her break. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, holding the test paper firmly in her hands. "I want to speak to the principal about this," she said firmly, her voice louder now, strong enough for the entire class to hear. A ripple of murmurs spread through the students. Some looked at each other, eyebrows raised. A few nodded in agreement, sensing that something wasn't right. But Mrs. Peterson only chuckled, her cold laughter echoing through the classroom. She folded her arms across her chest and shook her head. "Go ahead, dear," she said, smirking. "You really think they'll believe you over me?" Maya clenched her jaw. The challenge in Mrs. Peterson's voice was clear. She didn't think Maya had the power to stand up for herself. But that was where she was wrong, because Maya wasn't backing down. The school bell rang, signaling the end of the day, but Maya didn't feel the usual relief. Instead, her heart pounded as she made her way to the parking lot, clutching her crumpled test paper in her hands. The red F seemed to mock her, a reminder of the humiliation she'd endured in class. Once outside, she leaned against a lamppost, pulling out her phone with trembling hands. She hesitated for a moment, her thumb hovering over her dad's contact before finally pressing call. The phone rang twice before a deep, steady voice answered. "Hey, sweetheart. How was your day?" Maya's resolve cracked at the warmth in her father's voice. She bit her lip, trying to keep her emotions in check, but the tears came anyway. "Dad," she started, her voice breaking. "I think my teacher failed me on purpose." There was a pause on the other end, but not one of disbelief. When Mr. Carter finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried a sharp edge of determination. "Tell me everything, Maya." Through choked sobs, Maya recounted what had happened in class, Mrs. Peterson's mocking comments, the unfair grading, and the humiliation she felt in front of her peers. Mr. Carter listened intently, never interrupting, letting his daughter pour out all her frustration and pain. When she finished, his tone was resolute. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he said firmly. "I'll handle it. You go home, get some rest, and leave this to me." Maya wiped her tears, her grip on the phone loosening slightly as her father's words brought a sense of relief. She knew he meant it. When Mr. Carter said he'd handle something, he always followed through. The next morning, Maya walked into school with her head down, her stomach churning with dread. The memory of Mrs. Peterson's smirk still haunted her, and she wasn't sure how the day would unfold. She had told her dad everything, but what could he really do? Mrs. Peterson was a respected teacher, and Maya was just a student. She couldn't shake the doubt lingering in her mind. As she made her way toward the main office to grab a late slip, she froze mid-step. Standing in the hallway, tall and commanding in a perfectly tailored suit, was her father, Mr. Carter. His polished shoes gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his confident posture exuded an air of authority that immediately drew attention. A few students and staff stopped to look, whispering among themselves as he spoke with the principal, his tone calm but firm. Maya's heart skipped a beat. For a moment she hesitated, unsure whether to approach. But then Mr. Carter turned, catching sight of her, and his serious expression softened into a reassuring smile. He motioned for her to come over. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said warmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. The principal, a composed woman in her late 40s named Mrs. Ellis, adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter has brought some serious concerns to my attention regarding Mrs. Peterson's handling of your test," Mrs. Ellis said, her voice professional but tinged with concern. "We're going to investigate this matter thoroughly." Maya glanced up at her father, her eyes wide with gratitude and relief. He gave her a small nod before addressing the principal again. "All I ask," Mr. Carter said evenly, "is that my daughter is treated fairly. I've reviewed the test myself, and it's clear that most of her answers are correct. Mrs. Peterson's grading appears inconsistent at best, and at worst, deliberately biased. If this is how she evaluates her students, it warrants a serious review of her methods." The principal nodded, her expression serious. "I understand, Mr. Carter. I'll be speaking with Mrs. Peterson immediately. In the meantime, I'd like to sit down with Maya to review the test myself." Mr. Carter looked at Maya, his tone gentle but encouraging. "Do you feel ready for that, Maya?" She nodded, her voice quiet but steady. "Yes, Dad. I can do it." Later that morning, Maya and the principal sat together in her office, the test papers spread out on the desk between them. As Mrs. Ellis carefully reviewed each question, her brow furrowed deeper with every correct answer that had been marked wrong. Finally, she set the paper down with a sigh. "Maya," she said. "It's clear to me that your work was graded unfairly. You did an excellent job on this test, and your grade will be corrected immediately." Relief flooded through Maya as she sat up straighter, a small smile breaking across her face. "Thank you, Mrs. Ellis," she said softly. Mrs. Ellis nodded, her expression stern as she added, "And I will be having a serious conversation with Mrs. Peterson about her conduct. This kind of behavior has no place in our school." When Maya stepped out of the office, her father was waiting in the hallway. She ran up to him, throwing her arms around him in a tight hug. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. "Always, sweetheart," he replied, his voice full of pride. "You stood up for yourself. I just made sure they listened." As the two walked down the hallway together, the weight that had been pressing on Maya's shoulders was finally lifted. For the first time in weeks, she felt seen, heard, and, most importantly, supported. The tension in the office was palpable as Mrs. Peterson walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. She crossed her arms and sighed dramatically, her irritation evident. "Well," she began, her tone laced with sarcasm as her eyes flicked to Maya, then to Mr. Carter. "I assume you're here to argue about your daughter's grade, Mr. Carter?" Mr. Carter, calm and composed, offered her a polite smile. His posture remained relaxed, but there was a quiet authority in his demeanor that made the room feel smaller. "Actually," he said evenly, "I'm here to discuss something far more important, your career." Mrs. Peterson's smirk faltered slightly, confusion flashing across her face. She looked to the principal, who cleared his throat awkwardly before speaking. "Mrs. Peterson," the principal began hesitantly, her tone carefully measured, "I assume you recognize Mr. Carter?" Mrs. Peterson frowned, her confusion deepening as she glanced back at him. She tilted her head slightly, her voice sharp. "Why would I?" The principal straightened in her chair, her tone growing firmer. "Because he's the new head of the school district," she said plainly, her words cutting through the air like a blade. The room fell utterly silent. Mrs. Peterson's arms slowly dropped to her sides, her face draining of color. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Outside the office, students walking by began to stop, craning their necks to peek through the glass window. The whispers started softly, and then grew louder, spreading like wildfire. "The head of the district? That's Maya's dad? Did you see Mrs. Peterson's face?" Inside, Mrs. Peterson's confidence crumbled as she stared at Mr. Carter, who remained calm and collected. He didn't gloat or raise his voice. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, meeting her gaze directly. "Now," he said quietly, but firmly, "shall we continue this conversation?" The once condescending teacher, now visibly shaken, nodded mutely, realizing that her actions had consequences far greater than she had anticipated. Mr. Carter calmly reached into his briefcase and pulled out Maya's test paper, placing it squarely on the desk in front of Mrs. Peterson. The red F was glaringly obvious against the crisp white pages. "You marked correct answers as wrong," Mr. Carter said, his voice steady but sharp. "Care to explain?" Mrs. Peterson's eyes darted to the paper, then to the principal, then back to Mr. Carter. Her composure cracked as she stammered, trying to find the words. I must have made a mistake," she muttered, her voice trembling. "It happens. Teachers are human, after all." "A mistake?" Mr. Carter replied, raising an eyebrow. "The same mistake, repeated across multiple pages of the test? It seems deliberate to me." The principal leaned forward, her face stern. "Mrs. Peterson, this is unacceptable," she said firmly. "We hold our staff to the highest standards of integrity. You are suspended immediately, pending a full investigation." "Wait, Mrs. Peterson began, her voice rising in panic. "Enough," the principal cut her off. "This behavior has no place in our school." With that, Mr. Carter turned to Maya and handed her a corrected version of the test, now marked with a bright red A. Maya took it, her smile radiant as she looked at her father. "I guess I am cut out for this subject after all," she said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. The hallways buzzed with murmurs as Mrs. Peterson, her head bowed and face flushed with embarrassment, walked briskly toward the exit. Students leaned against lockers, whispering and staring as she passed. Some exchanged knowing glances, others shook their heads. The once intimidating teacher now looked small, her usual stern confidence replaced by a defeated shuffle. "That's what she gets," one student whispered. "I can't believe she did that to Maya," another added, their tone tinged with disbelief. Meanwhile, Maya walked through the same halls with her head held high, her corrected test paper tucked securely in her folder. The same students who had once giggled at her in class now nodded respectfully as she passed. Her best friend Lena ran up to her, beaming. "You did it, Maya," Lena said. "I knew you would." Maya smiled, her confidence shining for the first time in weeks. "I just needed someone to believe in me," she replied, glancing at the main office where her father stood waiting. As she reached him, Mr. Carter pulled her into a warm embrace. His voice was soft but firm as he whispered into her ear, "Never let anyone tell you what you can't do. You've got everything it takes and more." Maya nodded, her smile widening. As her father walked out, she turned and headed to class, each step more confident than the last. She was no longer just another student. She was Maya, the girl who had stood tall and proven her worth.